This is the journey to one Africa. So we all know that right now, as I'm saying, currently, I mean, US is already siding with Israel, and according to the news, they've already started to send some weapon and everything, you know, for the war to basically, it's kind of like they're promoting war to continue, right, by giving all the support that they need to fight against this group of Hamas. But we also know that African Union, you guys, you know, the side of African Union in 2021, the side of African Union is with Palestine. It's according to a draft declaration on the situation in Palestine and the Middle East circulated among reporters at the end of the summit. The AU not only expressed full support for the Palestinian people in the legitimate struggle against the Israel occupation, decrying the unceasing illegal settlements and Israel intransigence, but significantly argue member states to all end all direct and indirect trades, scientific and cultural exchanges with the state of Israel. So this is not a current news. This news, it happened in 2021, and so for a while Africa Union itself has been on the side of you know, Palestine, and you guys just heard what I shared. How do you think this is going to work out? Because we all know that African Union is not like an independent body. You know, they receive a lot of support from these countries that we're talking about, for example, the US and European Union, and we see that the side of that is on the other side. And also we know that African Union is standing with Palestine. How do you think this is going to work out at the end of the day? Anyone, you know, Gamma, you can go with that, and you know, Nikki, and yeah, I see Nick already unmuted there. You want to say something?
Yeah, well, I think historically Africa has kind of been with Palestine, technically speaking. Just like he mentioned, Nelson Mandela and everything like that. So I don't think it's a surprising take, really. It's kind of like when you think about it from the logical perspective, if it were Palestine before, if this were Palestine before Britain decided they wanted to say, hey, we're going to hand the country over here and rename it, kind of like what they did with the rest of Africa, when you think about it, then I can see where most of Africa would, especially the politicians, I don't call them leaders, but the politicians, they would most likely side with Palestine, just from that spiritual perspective. I'll put it that way. From that historical and spiritual perspective, I think they would default to that. The average person may not know enough information, so they would probably default to who knows and let them figure it out. I'll go back to that. Talking to most people is like, hey, we don't like the suffering that's happening, but I think that's where it goes. I think that's where it is pretty good there. But yeah, I think they will be siding with Palestine from that perspective.
Awesome. Colleagues, there's something that Niger said at the end that to me bewilders me, that it is not the major issue in this discussion. The human beings that are suffering. You know, I want to continuously, you know, relate this, because it happens in corporate as much as it is happening now with physical warfare, right? That we prioritize things more than we prioritize people. And it is just in our psyche, at the background of our thinking, where we say the infrastructure will be destroyed. The company's machinery, you know, someone, you know, in a research that I read, they said the aggression for physical warfare during peaceful times is transferred into businesses. And so the domination and the desire for victory is transferred into businesses. And so people then conquer territories. The new Napoleon is Jeff Bezos, you know, Bill Gates, you know, and those people prioritize things. They say our businesses, our equipment, our market share, our profit margins, you know, and more than they will say the people. And I think the moment we emphasize this, and we are then again taken back to the demographics of the discussion. When we say Africa is 1.2, 1.4 billion people, Israel and Palestine put together is 15 million people. And when we talk about de-escalating this matter, our priorities versus geopolitical priorities are super significant. And this is to say, what do we actually prioritize, right? Now we've deconstructed the religious thinking that is really rooted into this discussion that religion is insignificant. Secondly, one life sacrificed is one life too many. And then we then maybe come to a macro standard of saying, okay, from a continental point of view, who do we then side with? It becomes obvious, colleagues. And I think maybe for me to be redundancy, for me to continuously be repeating myself, who do we side? Because we know that America has favorites. Because America is a Christian nation, one nation under God. God bless America. It's written in the dollar, you know. And so America will stand with Israel. But funny enough, we had a very controversial man who in America was a president, and he came with the Abrahamic Accords, and he put together the Islamic nations, the Christian nations, and the Jewish nations together. Most criticized president who did the most outrageous thing, walked into North Korea, had a conversation with Kim Jong-un, who he had insulted and called him Rocket Man 3 months ago, and went to do the impossible, right? You know, so, and it's an interesting take. And so what I was saying in my previous statement was, we don't have to stand as South Africa with Nelson Mandela. He's not one of our most significant examples coming from this country, in my view. I would argue with Ezra on Nelson Mandela, him being a further more important example. I think what we need to create is a new narrative. And of course, as every generation comes up with one, right, we always think we're bringing new ideas, but anyway, new is the result of what's old. And I think, you know, we need to really focus and ask ourselves, should Africa or the Africa Union have a side that it takes? When there is an obvious side that it should take, and it is the side of human beings, guys. And these voices of humanism, you know, these voices of humanism, they are not political. I cannot throw you with political jargon into this conversation and act like I'm a politician. I am not a politician, you know. However, I think there is something that is continuously overlooked in the conversation, because we want to prove that we can speak English. Guys, English is not a measure of intelligence. Actually, English is, you know, other people's language, you know. I think the most important thing, colleagues, is, you know, human beings are dying, irrespective of they're Muslims or they're Christians or they're Jews. And so it should be a shame that the African Union can take a stance. And not a shame because Muslims are in Palestine and, you know, the Islam community is growing in Africa, but less than Christians, you know, which are always siding with Jews. But mostly it should be a shame because to take a side against human beings' lives that are sacrificed for no reason but corporate interests and religious propaganda, it should be something we're ashamed about. We should be here trying to ask ourselves, if the two-state solution does not work for Israel, what solution can work for us to be able to promote tolerance? What does tolerance look like? And I feel, you know, the pain of my brother. You know, you could already feel from the context he speaks by that Palestine is suffering more. And, you know, the intonation that says Palestine is suffering more because Israel has more weapons, it again suggests that the 5 children that die in Israel are suffering less. Of which what we have just done now, we've put on a scale suffering. Which suffering outweighs the other? So all of a sudden, the scale will forever pendulum, my brothers. There will never be consistency where we can strike peace. And so my brother comes from a position out of his conviction of, I'm assuming maybe, he's a humanist, maybe he's a Muslim, and he believes, in the Quran, written, by God, given to, a Prophet Muhammad Salah, blessed be his soul. But also my brother Ezra speaks being a Christian convicted. And so most of the time we try to avoid this position because it's non-political, but at the background of our minds, secularism doesn't work, guys. Secularism does not work. We are having biases. We are influenced by our convictions, and we must confront our convictions and deal with the humanist issue at hand. That whether people are Muslims or they are Jews, they are now suffering, and the suffering must end. There is no suffering, and I want to submit, guys, there is no suffering more than the other person. One life destroyed is one life too many. And I think maybe the conversation as well mustn't try to fit into popular narrative where we want to talk like we're Canadian politicians or, Canadian bloggers. We don't give a damn. I nearly gave a cuss word here, forgive me. We don't give a damn what Canada is talking about, guys. What we are interested about is what is our role into peace building. How can we create value that says we need peace? And we need to ask ourselves from the end, while we are beginning here, how does peace look like? Does peace look like Muslims and Jews coming together and hugging each other? And I like something our brother here said earlier. He said, it doesn't matter whether they are Christian, Jews, or Muslims. Particularly these three religions, if they treat black people like shit, they mean nothing to us. And the honest truth is Christianity, Islam, and even in Islam, not only Christianity is the father of racism in my books, but also, the black Muslims are not treated equally to the Arab Muslims. You don't know the difference between the Arab and, between the Arab and the Muslim. So for you to be a Muslim, you must be an Arab. The same way when you had to be a Christian, you must be an English, you must be a British, so you had to be a Brit, right? So I would say, we must emphasize and try to build solutions of saying, what solutions would the African Union take? How could we condemn the stance that the African Union takes with Palestine? Because the stance that the African Union took was because of the oppressive regime that came in times past, with Israeli funded, dollars into Africa. Colonialism came together, with Jewishness, because some of these guys here in South Africa, the Afrikaners said they were the people, they were the chosen people of God, and us South Africans, me and Ezra, we're the Canaanites. And so South Africa was, the chosen land of God, and so that superiority and that kind of mentality came with its Jewishness. And so now how do we then, reconstruct a new way of a new framework? I would suggest, these are my solutions. One, we must condemn that the African Union takes any stance that is not, that is religious or, geopolitical, in the sense that it stands with Israel or with Palestine. It must stand with human beings. We want to create a more human, centered society. I would start a petition that says, standing with human beings. We must denuclearize Israel. We must denuclearize. South Africa is not the best of countries. But after 1994, to prove that black people will not eat white people alive, we denuclearized. But South Africa was one of the world's biggest, weapon manufacturers, And so all of a sudden, for peace sake, we denuclearize. The first thing, let's denuclearize, guys. Let's denuclearize the Middle East. We cannot have two people who are fighting, and while they are fighting, they have weapons. So the United Nations, that is now the collective bodies, not those nations as a Niger, our brother differentiated. That body should agree that that community, that particular area should denuclearize for the sake of world peace, for the sake of, all of a sudden with two kids who are fighting, we give one a knife, we give the other one a sword, and then we say we expect peace there. There will never be peace. And so we know that this is making money, and so that would be where I'm landing my plane, guys. You know, I'll be landing my plane with criticism, a little bit of opinion in terms of what I think the way forward should look like.
Yeah, I appreciate Gamma for your insights. I want to ask you guys this as well. Anyone can go with this first. Do you think there's any connection with what is happening right now, not only there but all over the world? Like, you can take an example of Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine right now. You can take an example of what has been happening in Haiti, that now Africa, through Kenya, they actually going to send troops there, in that region. And also even what happened in the continent as well. Do you think there's any connection? And ever since, when we started with the pandemic, and then we came with Russia, and now we have this, and it's kind of like everywhere, people, this is the matter we're talking about. Everybody's being forced, to take side, right? And now through Africa, you see, the president of Kenya doing that, and I'm trying to reach out to the government of Kenya to have a conversation with them about this as well. Hopefully very soon I'll have a conversation to know their stand as well. But so do you guys think there's any connection with all these things that are happening kind of like, across the world right now? Do you see any connection? And if you see, what is that connection?
So for me, I believe this is the beginning of World War III, in my opinion, because you're asking about what I think. And the reason I say this, if you go back in history and look at how World War II started, or even World War I, but let's focus on World War II. It started as regional wars. It didn't just go to a full-blown world war. Regional first, and then it went to world war. So now we have Ukraine, Russia going on, and now if this one also escalates, then it becomes another war, and it's dividing. It's placing different countries on different sides. So US is gonna side with Israel, whereas Russia and China are gonna say, let's make peace, because they're not gonna side with Palestine. They're gonna say, let's make peace in Palestine and Israel. This should stop, and let's make it fair for everybody. That's what Russia and China are gonna say. So if this escalates, then you're talking about potential use of fear of use of nuclear weapons if Iran decides to join the party, right? And then Israel has its own nuclear weapons, and then the US is already sending equipment and carriers over there to Israel as we speak. So this is, in my opinion, the beginning, not just this one, but beginning with Russia and Ukraine. The beginning, and NATO, what NATO is doing, is the beginning of World War III, in my opinion.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate that, Niger. Nick, what do you think? And guys, you can still drop the comment section and your opinion right there. We'll get some time to read about this discussion as well.
Yeah, I mean, this could be one of the aspects of World War III, but in terms of the whole situation, I think I kind of summed it up earlier, because I guess I'll say it in a different way. Yeah, it doesn't have to do with Africa directly, just like many issues don't have to do with Africa directly. But what comes up is that Africa typically gets dragged into situations. And like I said, we cannot avoid the area on the map. It is in a middle ground, just like India is. India affects the rest of Asia drastically. So wherever India goes, you kind of get a tip of power that goes in that direction. If India decides to turn its back on China, China will lose a lot of power. This is why the US keeps trying to court them so hard. So it's not like India is insignificant, even though on one hand, they don't have as much of a big impact on economy, manufacturing, or anything else. But wherever they go, because of that middle central area over there. And I forget what the term is called. There is a term for like cradle of something or whatnot. But because of where it is, this is a very strategic point on the map. It is unavoidable. So no matter whoever owns the canal, no matter what happens in that situation, there's typically spillover. And especially if this is being approached from a quote religious standpoint, then tensions can pick up. Even though there's been racial standpoints for the longest over there, because of the religious one, some people align themselves to religion before anything to do with race, even if that same people with that religion will treat them like trash. They'll overlook it because this is my religion and I got to stand for it. So they'll do one of those things. So if that's the case, there's bound to be some spillover. And I don't know if this would be like the thing that say this is World War III though, because if anything, that started with Russia, Ukraine back in 2014. Like that started over there. If anything's like that, Russia's already said we've already started World War III. They've already said, look, this is the beginning of it right here, because they're just dogpiling. What else can you call that when you got the whole of Europe plus NATO or whatever piling on Russia, and then other conflicts are happening? I just think that part of this is also a distraction. And you know what? This is one of the points I wanted to make here. How about this? And I asked this to everybody, including the comment section. While there may be some concern from us about what's happening in Israel, has there been concern from Israel about what's been happening in Africa? Has there been those what some would call leaders, I would call politicians, have they been responding to come to the aid of nations in Africa? Because before we jump over hoops and say, well, you know, people are suffering over there and people are doing that, when's the last time many of these nations have turned around and said, you know what, people are suffering in Africa, Africans are suffering in Europe, Africans are suffering in China, Africans are suffering in the US, Africans are suffering here, let's take a stand with them and back them up. Not just words, not just kind of like what India does every once in a while, you know, the Black Lives Matter thing in the US, and they'll take digs at each other. That's what they do, so they can one up and say, oh, you say we're doing something bad, well, look at how you're doing your people over there. They don't really mean it. They're just using it as an undertone. Has Israel had a position of backing up the struggles of African liberation, Black liberation, just worldwide in general? Now, has the Palestinians had that same thing, had that same energy, even with what they're doing? Because people that are suffering, turns out people that are suffering still kind of take stands for other people. I mean, that's where we get panel discussions. That's where we're having this discussion right here. The whole of Africa is really suffering, and we're still having a conversation about Israel. Have they had that conversation about us? If not, I treat people how they treat me. I'm not going to kick you while you're down, but I'm not about to pick you up. That's not what's going to happen. You are suffering over there. That sucks, bro. That sucks. It really does. But if you have not been my ally, if you haven't been my friend, what do I need to turn around and then help you for? Like it really sucks that that's going on. Now, to my knowledge, from my limited information on this, the Palestinians have been allies, more or less, of Africans. That's what I have known. That's why I said, from a historical standpoint, I think that many African nations will default to supporting Palestine. Now, that's where I also get informed with that, because as I was refreshing myself on this whole thing, I was like, oh, yeah, I do know more than I thought I did. So the Palestinians in general, more often than they haven't, because it hasn't been 100% of the time, they have been siding with African nations in just the liberation struggle. So from there, that's where I will inform my decision and what that has to do with Africa. If you don't got anything to do with us, I ain't got anything to do with you. Tough, hold your own nuts. That's the phrase we use over here. So that's what I will have for them if we do some more deep diving, and that's what they've given us.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Mika. My brother is now falling straight to what I was saying when I was, calling it nonsensical for us to say it will affect us. This was not me being naive. you know, to you know, the rise of petrol and oil, if that region, blah 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 blah, all the political talk, right? No, no, no. This was me trying to deconstruct the big brother mentality. You know, we are still, as Africans, as a continent of 1 billion people plus, suffering from a big brother mentality, saying if these guys suffer, we will suffer. And you know, funny enough, before he said that, I'd already copied and pasted, you know, on our chat, you know, the following, right? These are the active wars or active conflicts since 2019 and today in Africa. And so what really, you know, positively triggered me was when he said that these guys, you know, sitting down and discussing us in a positive light. Guys, if you even look at the media of how some of these countries, how they project us, you know, guys like me, I have to start media companies to actually promote the positive picture of Africa, how they still, you know, they run the NGOs in Africa, and they still, you know, go to the poor villages to discuss the issues in Africa, you know, so that they can raise funds. The owners of the NGOs, you know, Dambisa Moyo is anti-NGO in Africa, as I am, right? Because the owners of these NGOs, they are in Israel, they're in America, they're in UK, they're in the Netherlands, they're everywhere in Europe, and they come in, take the poor pictures, and then they go raise funds there out of our sympathy, right? But if we look at the conflicts in Africa, recently we just had 4 coups or 3 coups in Africa, Burkina Faso, you know, since 2019, just on our private chat, these are the conflicts that have happened from Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is still in an upheaval today, guys. You understand? Ethiopia, Kenya, Mali. We ought to take an aggressive stance that deconstructs the big brother mentality. And we say it does not matter what they have. Even if tomorrow they close their borders, we don't care. You know, and then all of a sudden, we know that the 15 million people that are affected in these 2 countries, which already the UN has taken a 2-state solution. If they decide to leave that area, guys, they're going to go to Germany, they're going to go to America, they're going to go to other Arab areas. And because how they see us as well, they see us as poor nobodies. So for me, I immediately, you know, identify, you know, this conflict as a nonsense conflict, because I know there's no one sitting down thinking, the conflict that is happening in Burkina Faso, the conflict, we are the ones who are concerned because we are worried about our big brothers, you know. And the last thing that I'd like to also, you know, put into this position, we must also maybe factor and say none of Africa's military bases are in these countries. In actual fact, the United States has a military base in the USA and has many military bases in Africa, you know. And so because these countries have military power, you know, they are the ones, you know, that seem to be very important to the media. And I think we should stand with this other side, you know, the black conscious side, you know, whether you are, you know, mixed race African, you know, as long as you are a darker skin tone, you know, we must stand on this other side where you say, you know what, guys, this is really affecting us in a stupendous way. You know, this is also affecting us domestically in our country. And people ask, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the Israel-Palestine? You say, no, the issue in Burkina Faso, the issue in Burundi. You say the issue in the Democratic Republic. And I think once the conversation starts going there from ourselves, we then start looking inside rather than looking outside. And so what I was trying to say a little bit earlier, my brother, was that, you know, we have a big brother mentality, and we are so much concerned about our external issues. It does not mean we must be naive. We know that the rest of the world, China, Russia, we know that China is currently, you know, bringing in dollars, cash into Africa, taking over, you know, Africa. We are not naive of those things, that there's a new colonization that's coming, you know. And to your point of, you know, Africa historically has stood, you know, with with Palestine. And I want to say, the median today of Africa is the youngest population in the world. The median is 19 to 26. We are the biggest human resource in the world, and we are growing aggressively. And sad enough, right? Africans today, if they are to stand with any other thing, Africa is about 750 million Christians. Christianity, as much as people think it is not dwindling in Africa. We have the biggest mega churches. Mika himself attends one of the biggest mega churches in Tanzania. So young Africans are going to again fall into the trap of religious conviction, of standing with a Judeo-Christian position. And so I want us to really shy away from saying, in the past, because of Nelson Mandela, and I say this as a South African who is an ardent critic, I cannot stand with Palestine because of Nelson Mandela. The man is gone now, and so we must create progressive thinking of owning our own narrative. And I don't know, from an African-American point of view, how this, affects you guys. And I know that as an African-American, your root is in Africa and your heart is in Africa. But I think as a South African, I need to be very, very open that we must create progressive thinking of saying, in the past, because of colonialism and all of those things, people were standing, and the chances that young people will stand with Palestine are so small because people are Christians and they're going to have to stand with their faith, and so it becomes a very tedious conflict. And going back to the first thing that I said, that these are convictions that we're dealing with. As much as secularism tries to deceive us to think it will not matter, at the end of the day, you ask Mika in his archive, because Mika is going to close this channel one day, he's going to go back on his knees and he's thinking about, the second coming. He's thinking about, eschatology, that is the theology of the last days. And Mika is thinking, I'm working for my soul here. And so Mika is kneeling down with his Bible in a corner and saying, God bless Israel. And in his mind, when he says, God bless Israel, he does not mean the strip of land, he means the Jews. Do you see what I mean? And so there's a lot of conditioned thinking that is beyond 300 years before the normative source. And so religion is political in its nature. You may try to dodge it, you may try to avoid it, you may try to, innuendo around it. It is playing a crucial role into the decisions we make, into, the stances we take. And until we deconstruct religious thinking that is political by nature, and then we focus on Isintu, that is humanism, African humanism, which is a new, is an old political way of thinking of things, and saying, what is our interest? Delete religious thinking, deconstruct religious thinking, and then delete the big brother mentality. Although we know we will need America, we will need some of these things, but we have to be willing to sacrifice and suffer. Funny enough, this is called the Jewish effect. The first Jews that moved to America, they were willing to set up a foundation with their own blood. And so we have to be that generation that say, then we are going to ignore. It's going to be stupid, but we will. How can we create interest among ourselves? And I think also maybe this is a challenge that also the African-American community has to take. Will they sacrifice and leave America and come build the shambles of Africa with us and start from nowhere with nothing? And so it's an interesting case. I'm just, Ezra here, I'm taking chances, and challenging the thinking here, you forgive me.